Good afternoon, and welcome to episode one of season two of Perspectives on Sustainable Development. I am so excited to be here today and to get to season two because, frankly, most podcasts don't. And the reason we have is because, frankly, of you. We have grown to now be in over 55 countries off of an idea that I had last year and developed, frankly, in the basement of our house. I just want to start off with that by saying, don't ever let how big a thought might be stop you from trying to go forward on it. And especially in the complicated times we find ourselves right now, because ever since our last episode last year, frankly, a lot has changed and a lot has stayed the same. But obviously, a new administration at the federal level, a lot of changes that many don't agree with, but we have to adapt and try to focus in on what the science actually says and what objectively are risks for how we operate our businesses and actually live our lives, and how do those translate to health impacts. But before we jump in and introduce our guests, I wanted to actually play a clip from an ad that was just on the Super Bowl a few days ago. We're taping this around 5 days after the Super Bowl, and I was struck by an ad from a group called Climate Moms. And I'm gonna play what they put forward in a bit, but it's only about a minute long. But I want to also just have this as a way to start our conversation.
As a scientist, I know by the time she takes her first breath, 9 billion more tons of carbon pollution will be in the air. When she takes her first steps, wildfires will have burned millions more acres she could have explored. The day she gets her first pet, there are thousands of newly extinct species she'll never meet. The night she forgets to call, the night of her first heartbreak, her future home floods for the first of many times. By the time a child born today goes to college, it may be too late to leave them the world we promised. Our window to act on climate change is like watching them grow up. We blink and we miss it.
And that struck me for a lot of reasons, but it also just reminded me of why I do the work that I actually do every day and why I'm as passionate about environmental justice and climate issues as I am. Because when I start digging into these things, I think of my family and my children. The picture you'll see just over my left shoulder here, actually. I want to try and actually do the best I can to leave the world in a better place than I left it, largely for our children. And and every large planning decision that we make, no matter the industry, no matter the sector, it has to be with economic, environmental, and social impacts in mind, and the challenges of things like climate change, and objectively look at how do we combat each of these. So with that, I'm just going to stop there and welcome our two experts for today. We have Brian Barnes from South of 2 Degrees and Sheila Foster from Columbia University.
Thanks, Chris. My name's Brian Barnes. I'm a former candidate for U.S. Congress. I got mad at my member of Congress several years ago and decided to run, but came up short. But through that, had a lot of really valuable conversations about what people want in the future, what people are interested in. And through a series of several events that I won't bore your listeners with, I ended up founding an organization called South of 2 Degrees. And what that organization was, its original mission was to bring climate science to the layperson, to the policy person, to the NGO, because we identified this gap between scientific research that is written in a very specific way and translating that to the layperson so that they can understand it, so that they can make use of it, so that they can have it drive some of their own conversations, because that's where we know a lot of climate action comes from. From there, we've kind of expanded. We do a podcast as well. It's not as cool as yours, but it's a lot of fun, and have a lot of conversations, discuss these things at NASA, a lot of NGOs, just to help them understand how do you take this complex stuff and turn it into day-to-day conversation that'll help drive action.
Sure. My name is Sheila Foster. I'm a professor at Columbia University at the Climate School and affiliated with the law school. So I began my career in environmental justice back in the late 90s when environmental justice was just taking off, I think, as a real policy focus, I think, at all levels of government. I wrote one of the what is now one of the most used texts in the field called From the Ground Up, Environmental Racism and the Rise of the Environmental Justice Movement. Spent about a decade or so working with various communities, Camden, New Jersey, Chester, Pennsylvania, Harlem, both in a capacity. I'm trained as a lawyer in a legal capacity, but also working with various agencies at the state and federal level to incorporate environmental justice into all kinds of policies and approaches. And then pivoted from there to working in cities and trying to create sustainable communities, in part because I felt like environmental justice wasn't just about reacting to and keeping things out of neighborhoods, but creating real sustainable communities. And inevitably that led me to climate change. And then later was asked to sit on the New York City panel on climate change, which I've sat for since 2016, which brings the best science and social sciences to New York City to help adapt to climate change. And I've been leading the climate equity and climate justice work. So I'll stop there.
How is our country doing objectively as it comes to climate change impacts? Are things getting better? Are things getting worse? Are we currently on the right track?
Well, as of today, with our country pulling out of the Paris Agreement, I think that it remains to be seen what the impacts of that will be on the collective action of the world, because it's not really about our country, right? It is a collective action problem, and it will only be solved with the action of many nation states and subnational communities, including, here cities and states have a big role to meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, which we've already not met and in fact blown past. I will say that the Paris Agreement, the only obligation is to submit an annual, I'm sorry, a updated plan every few years. And before President Biden left office, he submitted what's called our nationally determined contribution, our NDC, with the goal of a very ambitious goal. I believe it's 30% reduction. I don't know that we'll reach that, but I think that it's a positive signal that at least many of us in this country would like to. And since then, we have collectivities or networks like the We're All In America, which is a collection of cities, states, private sector, nonprofits, and also climate mayors, and also international mayors that have said that we're going to work to achieve those goals, even if the federal government does not. So I don't know what our impact will be under the last administration. I think we set ourselves on an ambitious path, but I think we will struggle to stay there. So over to you, Brian.
Yeah, I would say everything Dr. Foster just said, but I would also just say, in summation, we're doing worse and better. And what I mean by that is, within the past couple weeks, we have set ourselves on a path to do much worse from a national perspective. But there is a lot of great things going on at the local level And I'm not even talking state, I'm talking neighborhood projects, things like that. And those individuals aren't following the lead of what's going on in Washington. They understand the crisis. They're pushing forward. They're doing what's better for their community and growing that movement. Now, the downside is that, to Dr. Foster's point, climate change doesn't respect man made drawn borders. And so it's an absolute global problem. But there is that hope in all these little projects summing up to keep us somewhat moving in the direction we need to. But I do want to be clear that right now, with the direction that we're headed, and I won't dive into the nitty gritty, we can do that later if you want, about what the current policies are looking like for how bad it's going to get. It is going to be a tough road.
Thank you both for that. There's a lot to kind of unpack there a little bit, but I think I want to get started on the Paris Accord itself. It's not the first time, unfortunately, that our country has backed out of it. The first time it happened, we saw other entities. I think Dr. Foster kind of alluded to this a bit, whether it's various mayors, various business groups step up to kind of pick up this slack for the federal government not being as proactive anymore. Do you think we can expect that also actually this time around?
I certainly think so. I mean, I think a couple things are different today than from 2017 when Trump first came into office. One difference is that the Inflation Reduction Act and the incentives, the carrots from that policy, um, have taken root in some industries. And I think that there's a transition underway, an energy transition that that whatever this administration does on policy through executive orders will not roll back. So for instance, there hasn't been a new power plant that's come online in years and probably will not come online. Solar and wind. So Texas is the biggest producer, I think, of certainly wind, maybe solar in the country. That's a red state. Even if you take away the EV incentives, EVs have gotten less expensive and more accessible. And so there are just a number of kind of macroeconomic trends that are in part because of the policies of the last administration, but in part because I think that's where we've been moving, even in the private sector. So I think that's different and that will continue. And I think the second thing that is different is that, we are more prepared as disaggregated actors, right? Aside from the nation state, like Brian said, from the community level and up, to be able to move this forward, this progress forward, pulling on different levers. Like we don't need the federal government to, from above, kind of move progress along, if we pull the right levers, right? And I will say that the policies, the IRA and the infrastructure act that in part funds like EV infrastructure and other infrastructure and congestion pricing in New York and a lot of other types of policies around the country, that those are kind of baked in. Those are some of those are congressional acts and can't be undone through executive order, although the funding is to the extent that the funding has not been spent, that will be pulled back. But a lot of that funding is out there, and private investment has matched that, if not exceeded that funding on the RA. So I do think that those two things are different. Like there's a transition that's well underway that has nothing to do with what happens in Washington, and it's in the private sector, and it's in the and the second is that in part because of that, a lot of disaggregated actors are have more power than they did in 2017 to counter, I think, whatever Washington is doing.
I think there are some things that are different as well. Um, it is a lot of that local action that we're seeing, and I forget I wish I knew what paper it was, so don't quote me on it. But it basically looked at how long does change have to be in place before people accept it as to the norm. And I want to say that's right on the order of about 2 years. It happens really, really quickly. And so as we look at these projects of, making energy efficient housing, using EVs, really driving these kind of societal changes and thinking about climate change on a local level, we've already passed into this is the norm. This is how we conduct ourselves. Now, can we do better? Absolutely. There's a long way to go. But as far as getting that kind of ingrained in the American psyche, I think we've got a really good start as far as pushing that forward because people are comfortable on that path. Sure, there is the big fight in Washington. Pretty soon we're not going to be able to use the word climate change. It's going to be revoked out of that. Eco instability, that's my new word to help drive everything. But so as the federal government kind of takes away, and there is that discourse online, when you separate yourself from the when you separate yourself from the noise, you really see this kind of action where people think of it almost as the norm now, and I find a lot of hope in that.
I would agree on that, but I guess just as a little follow-up and a spin-off of that, I guess, do you think businesses are enough across various industries see climate change as a risk long term to their business, to their bottom lines, to their supply chains, and have been acting accordingly?
Yes, they see it as a risk. And I think the quickest aspect to look at is the insurance company and what they're doing, where they're pulling their money out, where they're writing policies, where they're not. I think that's a great indicator to go, hey, look, this is in fact real because they're all about looking at how the climate impacts their bottom line. As altruistic as I like to pretend the world is, when you get to businesses, you have to realize that they are in business to make money. There are really no businesses out there. There are nonprofits, there's these other organizations that believe in supporting the environment, giving 1% to the planet, things like that. But at the core, a business is there to make money. And so a lot, especially, let me caveat that with publicly traded corporations. And so in order to really drive the needle forward on addressing climate change, you've got to make a value proposition to them. And what that is, there's no one size fits all. It's different to every kind of company. If you're looking at insurance, you're talking extreme weather events. If you're talking about a CPG company, a food company, you're talking about how that impacts the products that they grow and where their farms are and how they work with their farmers. So there is going to be an aspect even outside of government regulation that helps move those companies. Unfortunately, that's going to be a lot slower, and it's usually reactionary instead of proactive.
Yeah, absolutely. I say it all the time for um, environmental justice projects that I am on, and it holds true for climate as well. But states are really leading the way in a lot of different programs. I want to go back a little bit to again talk of the Paris Agreement. And I'm sure most people actually listening today know high level what's involved here, but the idea was stay under 1.5 degrees of actual warming to avert the the possible worst climate change impacts that are actually projected going forward. Unfortunately, it's pretty clear that if we haven't already, we're going to imminently go by 1.5 already. And Brian, your group took a little step higher potentially because you didn't think 1.5 was possible. I don't want to speak for you, but how ugly of a path are we currently on? Because we're seeing impacts like the wildfires in Los Angeles, like the hurricanes and cloudbursts in North Carolina, and so many others just rack up human and financial and environmental impact again and again and again and again. Um, where exactly are we headed here?
So, um, what you were talking about as far as my organization mentioning 1.5 might not be accessible anymore. What we base all of our information on is responsibly published scientific papers. So I want to be very clear, it's not us doing the research. What we do is distill down the research of scientists that are, either writing for the IPCC, working for NASA, things like that. And the one you're referencing, I believe it was called Global Warming Has Accelerated, Are the United Nations and the Public Well Informed by Hansen. And it just came out a week and a half ago, I believe. And there's a couple of interesting points in there. And to immediately answer your question, we're on a very bad path. Uh, there are some nuanced issues that makes him think that, and his team think that even 2 degrees is no longer a reasonable target. And very quickly, one of the things when you look at these climate models, they're very complex, extremely detailed, and that's just not part of the public conversation. Everybody just kind of zones out whenever you start going into details. But one of the things we've seen recently as we work to clean up our act was the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, a couple years ago said we're going to reduce the amount of sulfur in ship fuel by 86%. And you might go, oh, okay, well, that doesn't matter a whole lot. But you think about the amount of trade that goes around the world through shipping. And that produces a lot of particulate matter that's out into the atmosphere. And that works as a mirror, if you will, to reflect a lot of radiation heat energy back out into space. As we've cleaned that up, we have seen an increase in heating that a lot of the models didn't quite capture. And so we are seeing the temperature go up significantly. I want to say zero point 0.4 degrees C in just a few years. We've seen a spike. Now, yes, that couples with El Nino and a few other things, but the crux is that we've increased from the since 2010, we have increased 50% from what the 1970 to 2010 rate was. So we have rapidly accelerated. And according to Hansen, we're looking at, by the end of the century, netting out at about 4.5 degrees C, which is the IPCC's RCP 8.5 scenario, or worst case scenario. So I hate to be the big downer here, but that's the latest research that I have, and it just doesn't paint a good picture.
I it's not good, and I think that the impacts that you're seeing in the LA wildfires being the latest, the it's not that we haven't seen wildfires before, it's not that we haven't seen hurricanes before, it's not that we haven't seen extreme weather events before, but I think we are at the point where 100-year or 500-year floods and fires are happening now, right? And they're happening at a scale and devastation in which it's very hard not to attribute it to climate change. Although, again, the science is complicated and the projections are complicated. But I want to, move off the technical point to talk about something else the IPCC said in its last report, which it talked about social tipping points. And I think that's really the point here, which is, and what's a social tipping point? And it said we're at these, social tipping points where an event or events or a moment really begins to shift the way people, and that could be governments, that could be individuals, that could be institutions, go forward, right, with regard to these issues around climate and the transition. And we're seeing more of those social tipping points where, and sometimes it's a rapid onset event. If you think about, let's say in Africa, Cape Town, day zero, they almost ran out of water, or what we're seeing in many parts of the global south, climate migration from rural to urban that are simply overwhelming, right? Cities like Lagos and other cities. And the response is a transformation, a shift in people's attitude and in their actions. And that could be from we need to actually plan these cities, or, we need to think about our relationship to water. So I think we're having more of those social tipping points, right? And the LA fires will probably be another one, right? Where do we rebuild here? What is the trajectory for it? What's our relationship to space and place in the given the risk of climate? And so that I think, someone said, politics is, downstream from culture. I think if we get a cultural change like that, then, the governments and policy have to follow because people will demand it.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I think that's right. And unfortunately, a lot of these impacts over time historically have occurred more in overburdened areas than non-overburdened areas, and they also don't have the same capacity to respond and potentially rebuild and build back stronger, build back resiliency that that actually other areas, more affluent areas, could have. Do you want to speak a little bit as to what is causing that and potentially what could be done about it?
So I will say we are all at risk from climate change, right? Climate change is, it's an egalitarian, right, in its nature. But the problem is that when the impacts land, they land on unequal landscapes. And all of the inequality that's baked in to whether it's international, the differences between the resources of the North and those of the global South, or if in America, if the difference between communities that were, previously redlined, segregated, and now we have studies that show that retain those characteristics, those are the areas that are hotter, that flood more, that are in locations that are at greater risk, and also because of property, land loss, housing discrimination, real estate steering, appraisal discrimination. They're also the ones, and we're seeing this in California in Altadena versus the Palisades. They're the ones that are not going to be able to bounce back, whereas most of the people in a community that is fairly wealthy had insurance, not everyone, and has resources. That is, I think, where we see this. And also we see that from Hurricane Katrina through Hurricane Harvey, that when communities that don't have those resources cannot go back and rebuild, right? They end up migrating to places that are even less safe. So the folks that left New Orleans and went to Houston, let's say, right after Katrina, when Harvey hit Houston, they were vulnerable as well, right? And lost. And so, it's a problem that's wrapped up into systems of, social systems of inequality. And we see that pattern. And now we have the social science to back it up, right? Just like we have the science around, climate impacts, there is a climate justice science now. And we know that these things are connected and make, I think, climate impacts and climate change projections, another facet or dimension of inequality and injustice.
I think that's fascinating, especially, well, on a lot of levels, but there's going to be a time here, I think we've frankly already hit it, especially with the California wildfires, that the costs for these things are just being amortized over larger geographic areas and affecting more folks, and unfortunately wiping out culture in the areas like that Sheila just referred to that can afford to rebuild and might just have to move, frankly. And that's incredibly, incredibly unfortunate, but something we're seeing more of happening again and again. Um, I want to go
Yeah,
back to
Chris,
something.
if it,
Go ahead, Brian, please.
oh, I was just going to say, if I might add to that, um, I am far from the climate justice expert that Dr. Foster is, but I think one of the things that we also tend to overlook as we uh, think about climate justice a lot of times is we take this American centric view and where the disaffected communities, and you look at the common example we like to talk about outside the US is, what about these low-lying island nations? I was stationed on Diego Garcia out in the middle of the Indian Ocean. I want to say the high point on that island's like 9 feet above sea level. It's so you've got a bunch of these islands with communities that it's not only where they live, but it's where their culture is attached. And that creates an even bigger social problem because now when you have your not just your home taken away, but your culture taken away, that's a problem that we really haven't had to deal with. You can give somebody a new home. It's not like their old one, but you can't give somebody a new culture. And one of the times that it hit home for me was I was talking with one of the world's leading glaciologists, Dr. Heidi Silvestri, amazing science communicator, amazing scientist. And we were actually talking about tropical glaciers. So most of the time you think about glaciers on the poles, but there's a lot of mountain ranges along the tropics that have glaciers. And the interesting thing about that is the tipping point, the point of no return there is actually a heating of 1 degree C. So we have already passed that. So we know those glaciers are going to go away. And at first you go, well, that's not going to increase sea level. So what does that really matter? You might have some flooding, but it's going to be temporary and then it goes away. No, there's a lot of communities that have spiritual cultures tied to these glaciers. And when they're gone, then you have this gap in their society, in their culture that we can't remake. We can't just give them a new glacier and say, "Oh well, over here we can believe the same thing," and that's a really tragic thing that gets missed, I think, in the climate justice conversation some of the time.
Yeah, no, I think that's a powerful point. And I would say that there are two aspects of the climate justice conversation. One is clearly domestic, but the other is
Yeah,
international. I think also we tend to, I think there's more in common with what you just said, Brian. Like when people have to lose their communities, they lose their culture,
yeah,
social capital,
yes,
social ties, wherever that is. But I think the difference with small island states is that they're also not just culture, not just homes, as you say, but they're actually losing a nation state. Like
hmm
their place of citizenship. And one aspect I think to that we've seen, and it was adjudicated in front of the UN, is that like a small island state that's close to Kiribati, New Zealand, that many countries have limits on how many folks can migrate and immigrate to those
hmm
places. So they can't, so they lose their nation state, the very idea of them being a citizen of a place, in addition to all these other losses.
yeah,
But I completely agree. I think that
yeah.
the international dimension of climate justice is as thick and has slightly different, I think a slightly different, it looks at least on the surface, but when you scratch the surface, I think the migration, the losses, et cetera, there's a lot more in common than that are different.
Absolutely. And it's not a one is more important than the other or one needs to be talked about more than the other. It's all tragic across the board because you're talking about when you look at it from a person centric point of view, it's a tragedy to whoever's involved. whether it's LA or whether it's a mountain community in South America. It's all just, it's tough.
Yeah, and the loss and damage conversation that was happening, I think, at the conference of parties at COPs that, to your point, I think, Brian, that, even as much inequality as we have here, like we are still the major historical emitter of greenhouse gases.
Yes. Yeah.
The most contributed to the least to the problem historically, right? And so,
Mhm.
and they're being completely wiped out, like not just island states, but whole places, in ways that are quite devastating. And they have less resources and ability as both a country, but also certainly as communities to bounce back.
Absolutely. I think the loss and damages initial framework was critically important. But as I first read about it, I couldn't help but also remember the unfortunate fact that most international environmental agreements don't get funded up to pledge levels. And that's a huge problem to begin with anyway. So even hypothetically, if we take a couple steps forward here and get countries pledging whatever amounts they are, it's actually bringing those dollars in before it actually can affect positive change. But I'm happy the conversation went to here actually because I was going to be bringing up immigration next and the fact that climate change is a huge driver of immigration now and projected to be even larger one going forward. And we're just coming off a election in this country where immigration was a hot button issue, and some would argue inspired very conservative policies in other countries as well. What will the impact potentially be, or perhaps said another way, is it going to take another social tipping point to get people to get other countries to understand that they're gonna have to, over time, find a way to get better with immigration reform? Sorry, that's a very long-winded question.
I'm going to let Brian go first. I have things to say, but I'm really curious to hear from Brian.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you, Dr. Foster. Yeah. Uh, Immigration is a very difficult issue. And I know that that sounds like a very bland, overarching comment to lead with. But whenever we face tragedy as a person, we always tend to go insular very, very quickly. And it puts us in this situation of us versus them instead of we. And one of the tragedies with climate change is you have so many places where you're facing climate instability. And we talk about climate change in the context of global warming. But one of the reasons that I said, eco instability is one of my favorite new terms for when climate change gets banned, is that all these different ecosystems are becoming less stable as the planet warms. And that's one of the hallmarks of climate change. And human society has developed within a lot of these predictable ecosystems. And so, as those change, where we get droughts or floods or fires, people aren't going to be able to maintain their livelihood. And they're going to look for other opportunities. And whether that's across international borders or whether that's across state borders here at home, you're going to see as the weather, as the climate becomes less stable and less predictable, we're going to end up in this spot where we've got to figure out how to manage these influxes of people. Is it difficult? Absolutely. Because it's not as easy as just saying, well, hey, come on in, we'll figure it out, because you've got so many financial and health and human services and all these different pieces. And beyond that, you've got to go, even just thinking about language barriers and how this happens. And we tend to think of it in the US from a southern border. and we talk about it that way. But then when you look at a map, and I would encourage all your listeners to just pull out a Mercator projection of a map, yeah, of the world, which is just the squared off map. Look at it and look at all the different borders. And then imagine people in just kind of this mass switching going across all these different borders. It's a really complex problem. And it's something that we can't just go, here's a little way that we can solve it. Here's a little soundbite. So I know that doesn't dive into necessarily the details that you were looking at, Chris. And I would say Dr. Foster's probably in a much better position to go into the details there. But I think that kind of frames in people's mind the complexity of the problem, and also knowing that it's going to happen. It's just a matter of when and how quickly we're going to see that occur.
Yeah, and I would second, it's a very complicated problem. I mean, as with any kind of policy shift, you have to start with data, right? And the data we do know, and I think it's incomplete, and there's a need for new data, is that most climate-induced migration is internal to countries and regions, right? And some have suggested that the southern border of the US is an exception to that when we look internationally, that there is more climate induced migration there. I mean, it's mixed up as it is around the world with economic
Mhm.
and and also politically induced migration. Sometimes you can't quite tease those out. So I was working for many years with global mayors, and one of the things we did was uh, we conducted a kind of qualitative project, just asking, in particular, African and Global South mayors what they were seeing in terms of migration into their cities that are growing exponentially and in ways that are really harmful in terms of, sustainability, sustainable infrastructure, keeping people safe. And they were very clear that they were seeing climate-induced migration from rural areas that were having cyclones, like just wiping out, droughts, like people in rural communities can no longer feed themselves and do not have economically viable ways. And they are coming to places where there is an economy, and that's typically cities. Sometimes they're going back and taking stuff back. Sometimes they're creating new homeless populations or new unhoused populations. So the problem is there, but right now, at least climate, it's mostly internal to countries. And so I
Hmm.
want to separate that from, I think, the larger and to regions, right? And I want to separate that from the larger conversation about immigration, which I think Europe is having and we're having, and is also arguably fueling, I think, really far right movements. And that's a that's not a climate. That's a cultural conversation about who they think is Italian or who they think is Spanish or who they think is French or who they think is American. And I think that's a wholly separate. And so when we talk about immigration reform at the policy level, that's what people are talking about. They're not talking about, immigration reform in response to climate induced migration. They're just not.
Mhm.
And so we may see better data on that, but I think it really is a conversation that's driven by cultural factors that may, in the Venn diagram of things, overlap with, climate-induced migration, but is not framed that way at all. And that's not the
Hmm.
motivation behind the conversation. As someone who spends time in lots of places, Europe, Africa, South America, and here, I just think the immigration debate is right now largely cultural and frankly reactive.
Yeah, I see
Yeah.
cultural, but also driven by certain objective actual realities. Just hypothetical for you. If a farmer in South America can't farm anymore because of excessive heat or a drought, might make him more likely to take that extraordinarily long trip up to America and go through all those incredible dangers, frankly.
Well, but I think that there are lots of, so this is what I mean by regional. Latin America or South America is huge. It's not clear to me that the first stop is to cross, that southern border. If I'm in Chile, why wouldn't I go to Santiago? If I'm in Mexico, but if I'm in a country with an unstable or a dictatorship, and I feel my life is in danger, that's where we see, or I don't see any opportunities in the region, then I think yes. And that's why I say it's mixed. You can't really determine is it climate or economic or mixable or some mix. And probably in some cases it's quite the motivation's mixed, but I wouldn't assume that. And again, we're not seeing that. We're seeing rural to urban migration in
Hmm.
Yeah.
right as a result in terms of climate induced. People are losing their livelihoods. And the first place they're going to look is within their country and then within their region.
Yeah.
And that's setting aside political refugee related considerations. I think it's different. That's a different driver of immigration, right? Their country, you're in Haiti or you're, like it's just unstable and dangerous, frankly. And
Yeah.
people feel for political or other reasons that they cannot make a life there.
Now, yeah, you kind of just alluded to this too, but that brings me to the next thing I wanted to cover. A lot of this projected migration and what's already been witnessed has been rural to urban, and cities have been planning on various levels for climate change for quite a long time. Just, speaking from actually my own history, I can remember first reading Play NYC and being inspired by what the Bloomberg administration was attempting at that time. Are cities building any type of consideration for potential increased populations over time, thinking that part of this might come from migration? And if so, what type of constraints do they have? Because obviously there's only a finite geography.
Do you want to lead off with that one, Dr. Foster?
Yeah, I'll just say it depends on which cities you're talking about. If you're outside of this country, I think African mayors would tell you they don't have any urban planning authority. Sometimes they don't have resources. I mean, that's kind of the bind they're in. They are looking for partners. I was just in Madrid at the Institute on Sustainable Cities with an African mayor who was making this point. Again, and I've heard it again and again. If you're talking about American cities, I think we say in the climate area, there are certain receiving cities that are on higher ground. Let's say, like if you're in, Louisiana, Baton Rouge may be a receiving city, right? From people moving from New Orleans, or parts of the Midwest, Detroit or others are seen as receiving cities because they're not going to get the kinds of climate impacts that, let's say, a North Carolina or cities along the coast or in the Southwest or in Florida will have. But I don't know of any mayor or city that is explicitly planning to be a receiving city that actually, including New York, because I, work with the mayor's office in terms of, again, giving the best science and also, um, recommendations to adapt, to plan. I haven't seen any language about migration as induced by people leaving North Carolina or Florida, et cetera. So it may be in the ether, but I'm not sure in cities. But what cities are planning for, to your point, and it almost doesn't matter whether we mention migration. Cities are planning to make their resilient or to make themselves more resilient and to adapt. And that could be, take New York City as an example, seawalls, a requirement for solar and green roofs, managed retreat in the Rockaways, except, right? I mean, moving energy infrastructure, preparing for and helping to alleviate flooding of public housing. So that's what cities are doing, right? And no matter who's there, who's moves there, how much they grow, that's the core of, I think, climate adaptation work, at least in the US. Over to you, Brian.
Yeah, I have not heard of any specific city either. I've heard conversations of certain cities need to be prepared for climate migration. One of the examples that I was reading about, oh, I'd say probably about a year ago, and don't quote me on this because I'm probably going to get some of this wrong. Um, but when you look at the freshwater supply that you have down for Miami, there is a continual encroachment from seawater as we get sea level rise towards their uh, basic bowl, if you will, of fresh water. And once briny water kind of breaches into that reservoir, it's not something that you can just go, oops, I'm sorry, and pull it back. And so the story was written around the gentleman who manages the freshwater systems for Miami in that reservoir. And he said, hey, if it were me as the mayor in Orlando, I would be preparing for a slug of people to move from Miami to Orlando because there's going to be a real water problem here in the not too distant future. Um, but then I haven't heard anything about the city of Orlando saying, hey, we are in fact planning on people coming here. So to Dr. Foster's point, there's a gap there where I haven't heard a lot of that stuff. But to her point as well, cities are in general looking at, hey, how do we make a more resilient grid, right? So and they're thinking of it in terms of their current citizens, but as you make a more resilient grid, it's able to absorb more of the climate migrants, if you will, into those cities. Or you talk about and there's a ton of science on this, and it's a fascinating side conversation, but the greening of city spaces and how that can actually reduce the temperature in these urban areas. That's something that cities are doing right now, but it also prepares for when people come in and they live in these denser environments, they're not going to be exposed to the heat islands that you would normally have. So it's a yes and no answer to your question. And unfortunately, so much of the climate conversation is kind of right there in that realm. Um, Everybody likes the quick answer, but there's so much nuance there.
And let me put a fine point in that. I do think cities are aware of the massive urbanization happening around the world. And so it almost doesn't
Yep.
matter whether people are migrating for climate or because that's where,
Great point. Great point.
and so that's what I think I've been hearing in working with mayors for is that the world is urbanizing and people are coming to cities and cities are, if you look at the GDP out of cities, if you look at where the jobs are, if you look at the urban wage premium, and so I think that's so they know they're growing. They know that their infrastructures are under stress. Housing is the first, right, kind of infrastructure. They know that the energy infrastructure is going to be under stress from lots of things. And so they're responding to that, right? But embedded in urbanization trends, I think, is climate migration, even if no one's pulling that out as a specific driver of urbanization that they're responding to.
Absolutely. And I can't believe I'm saying this, but we're actually already almost up on time. So I want to be extremely respectful of both of your time here and just start wrapping up a little bit. But I always try to ask a version of the same question because it turns out, and I learned last year that the biggest demographic that listen to this podcast is largely young people, whether it's high school students, college, graduate students from all over the world, surprisingly um, that are interested in these issues. What potential advice would you have for them on how they could potentially get involved? And as I said earlier, take on projects that start to move the needle a little bit and not just get paralysis from how huge of an issue or collection of issues all this actually is.
I'll dive in on that, and let me just first acknowledge that climate anxiety is a very real thing. Climate depression is a very real thing. And honestly, I think there's going to be a great job for therapists in the future specializing in climate scientists and client communicators, because when we deal with this every day, it's not the happiest of conversations. But for young people who see it, who read about it, especially if they hear us talking as your listeners about Hanson's paper, and they go, oh my God, 4.5 degrees, that's horrible. And they start to draw in. I like to think about it. I love kind of analogies and like to think about it in simplistic terms. And nature finds a way. and you think of an individual, and I also think of a giant slab of concrete and a dandelion. That dandelion is a little tiny thing, but yet it can break through that concrete and shine and absolutely create a little environment, a micro environment around it. And so, as young people think about the weight of this issue, think of it like that giant block of concrete, and your small actions can actually help break through, even though they don't seem like it. And one thing that I have absolutely loved hearing Dr. Foster talk about is the social sciences, because I feel like that's such an important miss a lot of times when we talk about the natural sciences. And when you look at the social science aspect of the natural sciences, one of the things that we've found is that you can influence over 50% of your immediate friend group, both friends and family, just with conversations. Beyond the talking about stuff helps us process things. As you talk about climate change, as you normalize that conversation to those people around you, you actually have a much bigger influence on those individuals in your inner circle than you think. And that spreads. And as that continues back to where we talked in the beginning, it only takes a few years for people to think of things as the norm. Um, so for young people, the message is your voice, as small as you feel, can have a difference. It doesn't matter whether you're on an international stage or you're just in your neighborhood, your voice makes a difference. And as far as getting involved, whether you want to write to NGOs, write to organizations, write to your members of Congress, some of them better than other at responding, maybe. But there is this piece of civic action there, or just get involved with like a local neighborhood community farming group. All those pieces add up. And that's where I find peace. That's where I find hope. And that's where I would say that young people should really look as be that dandelion, right? Break through the concrete.
Yeah, that's great. I do think we need to end with a message of hope and forward looking, right? So in fact, there is a field on climate psychology, right? Because I think that, there is a lot of anxiety out there. But I would say two things. I mean, and I'm going to speak from an empirical perspective, what I see in young people. I have a 20-year-old son who's in college, and also I teach 20 and 30-year-olds, 20 and 30-year-olds. And I think, first of all, the climate movement and climate justice movement is led by young people these days. If you look at the litigation around the world, if you look at who's in the streets, if you look at the representatives like AOC here and others who and who are running for office, I think they're the ones that see this is our future, and if we're going to change it, we have to be out there. So that's number one. I just think that they're already, in front. Not everyone, but I think that they can be inspired by their peers, those who are not and aren't sure what to do. And that leads me to my second point. The other thing I'm seeing is that a lot of young people, particularly my students, see the climate crisis as a opportunity for where do they work to craft a better world? Because they know what the problem is. But they see in a way sometimes, I think a lot of us don't see, is the way that climate is connected to every facet of our life and our systems. If you're interested in economics, you cannot work in economics or business without understanding climate risk, climate accounting, climate budgeting, et cetera, et cetera. If you are interested in the environment out there, nature, you can't really understand that without understanding what climate's, doing to species. If you're interested in urban development, you can't really work in cities without that lens. And what they're seeing is opportunities to create new forms of, I think, work and activism and NGOs, et cetera. And we've seen this in the last few years, these new startups. A lot of my students are going to work for startups or in the private sector. They're at NGOs. So literally as we speak, climate is driving so much of opportunity for it, data, AI, you name it. So I do think if you see this as an opportunity to create the world that we want, it's a social tipping point. Climate is, we're all now seeing it. 10, 20 years ago, all we had were projections, but now we're living it. I think they see it as an opportunity. And it is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to be that dandelion. It's an opportunity to, chart a path that can benefit so many people. So I'm optimistic. I am, in part because of young people.
And I love the fact that we just went through about an hour of heavy stuff and are ending on hope. And that's how I always try to end these. So, Brian and Sheila, thank you both very, very much. I found this extremely informative, and I'm sure the listeners will too. And for everyone listening here today, if you haven't done so already, you could follow us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, all the 130 podcast platforms that are out there. And I sincerely hope you enjoy the content and keep coming back and keep finding those areas for hope and opportunities to be a dandelion, as Brian Sheila said here. So, with that, I will say thank you very much, and everyone have a nice day.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for having us on.
Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you, Dr. Foster.